So as a child, you learn these things and you accept them on faith. And I still have that faith, but as I got older, I came to it through intellect and through reading. The written word was very important because it was, you got all those books, the Bible, you've got the different gospels and stuff that people are quite familiar with.
Mel Gibson once spent around $30 million to create The Passion of the Christ, one of the most talked about religious films in the world. But the story doesn't end there. Later, he came across a Bible that completely shook his thinking. It made him question almost everything he believed about Jesus. This wasn't just any ordinary book, and it wasn't some internet theory either. It was the Bible of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, carefully preserved for nearly 1,600 years. The special part? It contains 81 books, including 15 that you usually won't find in most common Bibles. Now here's where the real twist begins. In these additional books, there's mention of something that the Western Church has never fully explained: the 40 days between Jesus' resurrection and his ascension. Just think about it. In the New Testament, this entire crucial event is wrapped up in just a few lines. Jesus comes back to life, meets his disciples, teaches a few things, and then ascends to heaven. That's it. Such a huge moment, told in such a short way. So the question is, why? It's not as simple as saying the rest of the writings were lost. In reality, some important documents ended up in regions that were beyond the control of the Roman Church or any king or council. That place was Ethiopia, where monasteries were so isolated that monks had to climb straight cliffs using ropes just to reach them. That isolation was their protection, their peace. And inside those monasteries, where books were copied by hand for centuries, a text managed to survive, one that claims to describe what Jesus actually taught during those 40 days, what warnings he gave, what he said about the future of his message, and maybe why some people didn't want these teachings to reach everyone. Now, how much of this is true and how much isn't? That's a different debate. But one thing is certain. After hearing this story, anyone would pause and think. If you enjoy hearing such untold and fascinating stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Mel Gibson has read that mysterious book, and now he's planning to make a film based on it. But according to him, this is not an easy task at all. He says it's a huge and difficult project, so much so that even he isn't fully sure he can do it justice. Still, he wants to give it at least one honest try. Now understand the real point. The New Testament describes the full 33 years of Jesus' life in quite a bit of detail, and especially his final week, before the crucifixion, is explained in long chapters across all 4 Gospels. For years, even centuries, scholars have tried to understand every single word of those final moments. But when it comes to the 40 days after his resurrection, everything suddenly becomes very brief. The most information comes from the book of Acts, where it simply says that Jesus appeared to his disciples for 40 days and spoke about the kingdom of God. Just one line that sums it all up. The other Gospels add a few details, like appearing in a locked room, breakfast by the sea, the journey to Emmaus, and the final command. Even combined, they barely form 8 to 10 moments covering those 40 days. And yet, this period is considered one of the most spiritually significant in Christian history. So again, the same question: why so little? For years, the common answer has been there are no records, meaning whatever was said during those 40 days was either never written down or simply didn't survive. But this is where the story takes a turn. In Ethiopian tradition, there's mention of a text called Mashafakadon, also known as the Book of the Covenant. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, it's not treated as an extra or a footnote. Instead, it's given importance equal to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It is said that this text records the very teachings that Jesus shared with his disciples during those 40 days, the teachings that are missing from the rest of the world. Now, Western scholars are divided on this. Some believe it is based on very ancient traditions that could go back to the early Christian period. Others see it as religious literature written at a later time. But on one point, almost everyone agrees. It is old, it is authentic, and its contents are quite different from the Western Bible. If you've never even heard its name in your church, that might not be just a coincidence. And this is where the story becomes even more interesting. How did Mel Gibson come to know about it, especially when most people in the West had never even heard of it? If you're hearing this for the first time, make sure to subscribe to Never Told You, because here we explore the stories that go beyond where official records end. Now let's go a little back. In 2003, Mel Gibson made a decision that Hollywood considered a risk to his career. He invested around $30 million of his own money to create The Passion of the Christ. No big stars, no major studio backing, and most importantly, the entire film was shot in Aramaic and Latin. Not a single line of English dialogue. Every major studio rejected it. But what happened next, no one expected. Most people believed that no one would watch such a film, a 2,000-year-old story of crucifixion, told in languages that are no longer commonly spoken, and stretching for 2 full hours. But the opposite happened. The Passion of the Christ went on to earn around $612 million worldwide, but very few people know the real story behind the making of this film. Mel Gibson didn't just shoot it casually. He spent years preparing, speaking with Bible scholars, learning from those who knew Aramaic, and consulting theologians who didn't always follow the mainstream Hollywood Christian perspective. Or his goal was clear. He didn't want a polished, easy version of the story. He wanted to get as close to real history as possible. Even after the film's release, that passion didn't fade. For years, he has been working on its next chapter, a sequel based on the resurrection. And during this time, he mentioned something that caught people's attention. He said that the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has additional books that are not found in most Western Bibles. These books in particular talk about the time after Jesus' resurrection, those same 40 days that his upcoming film is expected to focus on. He also made it clear that these are not texts that were rejected as fake by the church. Instead, they were writings known in early Christian communities. Considered sacred for a long time, just not included later when the Western Bible was finalized. Now, whether this was just coincidence or a deliberate decision, that can be debated. But one thing is certain. These texts ended up preserved in a completely different corner of history, and along with them, Ethiopia followed its own unique path. Now understand the most important link. Mel Gibson's upcoming film is specifically focused on the 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension. And this is the exact period that the Book of the Covenant is said to describe in detail. This similarity doesn't feel accidental. Without saying it directly, it clearly hints at the kind of sources he might be looking at, and the direction he wants to take the story. But one big question still remains. When the rest of the world lost these texts, how did Ethiopia manage to preserve them? To understand that, you have to look at the history of Ethiopia. One interesting and lesser-known fact is that Ethiopia has been one of the few African nations that largely avoided long-term foreign colonization. While much of Africa came under European control during the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, losing governments and cultural structures, Ethiopia resisted that pressure multiple times and managed to preserve its identity. And maybe that's exactly the reason why some things managed to survive there, things that were lost in the rest of the world. If you want to hear more unheard, mind-bending stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because here we bring you the stories that are usually never told. In many places, languages were suppressed and traditions were changed. The missionaries didn't just bring religion, they brought an entire system that slowly reshaped local cultures. But Ethiopia clearly refused to bow to that pressure. In 1896, Italy tried to turn Ethiopia into a colony. At that time, Menelik II prepared his army and defeated the Italian forces in the Battle of Adwa. This victory was so significant that even today it is considered one of the most surprising and important victories in African history, because back then it was almost unthinkable for an African nation to defeat a European power. Now the question is, what does this have to do with the Bible or religious texts? The answer is simple. Wherever colonialism reached, it didn't just change land, it changed religion too. Local texts were ignored, traditions were labeled as wrong or superstitious, and in their place, as a European religious structure was imposed. But Ethiopia didn't allow that to happen. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions in the world, developed its own beliefs, rules, and forms of worship without falling under the influence of Rome, Constantinople, or Canterbury. Its roots go back to the 4th century, when the Kingdom of Aksum officially adopted Christianity, and this happened even before the Roman Empire itself fully embraced it. That means it wasn't just a branch of Western Christianity, but a completely different path, built on its own language, its own thinking, and its own texts. And because of that independence, some things survived here that disappeared from the rest of the world. Then enters a key figure in this story, James Bruce. Born in Scotland in 1730, Bruce wasn't just an explorer, he had a deep interest in languages and ancient texts. In 1769, he traveled to Ethiopia in search of the source of the Blue Nile. He spent several years there, learned Ge'ez, and gained access to monasteries that no European had reached before him. And then, what he found there changed everything. Inside monasteries located in Ethiopia's high mountains among ancient archives, he discovered the complete original version of the Book of Enoch, a text that people in Europe had only heard about but had never fully seen. And from there began a chain of events that changed the way people looked at the history of the Bible. Now it's important to pause here and understand, because the Book of Enoch is not an ordinary book. It is considered one of the most unique and influential writings from early Jewish and Christian traditions. It is named after Enoch, who, according to the book of Genesis, was a man who walked with God and was taken to heaven without dying. In simple terms, his story itself is on a completely different level. So what does this book contain? Visions of heaven, encounters with angels, the origin of evil, the story of the Watchers who came to earth and formed relationships with humans, and even prophecies about the end of the world. Now here's the most interesting part. Early Christians actually considered it a sacred text. It is directly mentioned in the Epistle of Jude, almost word for word. Early church scholar Tertullian also considered it authentic and trustworthy, and in the Church of Alexandria, and it was even treated as part of Scripture. But then, this book slowly disappeared from the Western world. For nearly 1,600 years, no one had a complete copy of it. A few fragments survived here and there, but the full book, the way early Christians once read it, was nowhere to be found. Then in 1773, James Bruce returned from Ethiopia carrying 3 complete copies of it. One of them is still mahfuz today in the Bodleian Library. Later, scholar R.H. Charles, who dedicated his life to studying and translating Ethiopian manuscripts, said that the survival of this book for such a long time is one of the most remarkable events in history. Just think about it. After more than 1,000 years, when Western scholars finally read it in full for the first time, they were shocked. And this was the same book mentioned in the New Testament, the same one early Christians used to read, and it hadn't survived in Rome or Jerusalem, but hidden away in the mountains of Ethiopia. And that's where the real question begins. If this book could survive there, then what else might have survived? And where exactly was all of this preserved? To understand that, you have to imagine a place, Debre Damo. It's a monastery in northern Ethiopia, built on top of a flat mountain, surrounded on all sides by sheer vertical cliffs. There's no easy way to get there, no road, no stairs, no path. There's only one way in, Monks at the top lower a leather rope, and you have to climb straight up the cliff holding on to it. And yes, one more thing. Women are not allowed to enter this place. These were the kinds of locations where, for centuries, such texts were kept safe, far from the eyes of the world. Debre Damo is a place where time almost feels frozen. Built in the 6th century, it still follows its ancient rules to this day. The monks there have been writing and copying manuscripts by hand for nearly 1,500 years. This isolation was not accidental. It was a deliberate choice, so that the outside world couldn't influence what was preserved inside. While wars were being fought below, empires rising and falling, and foreign powers reshaping cultures, this monastery remained beyond their reach, and because of that, many ancient texts stored here survived exactly as they were centuries ago. Interestingly, these texts weren't hidden from the world on purpose. The language itself became the barrier. Most Western scholars couldn't read Ge'ez, so even though these manuscripts existed, they remained almost invisible to them. Scholar Getachew Haley also noted that until the late 20th century, many of these manuscripts had not been properly studied. Later, researchers like Ephraim Isaac, especially at Harvard University, began translating them. Only then did those doors begin to open, doors that had remained closed for centuries, and the world realized that this wasn't just about a few different ideas, but an entire parallel tradition of Christianity. Now the same question comes back again. If all this remained hidden for so long, then what exactly was said during those 40 days that Western texts barely describe? To understand this difference, we have to go back to 325 AD, when Constantine I called the First Council of Nicaea. At that time, Christianity was not a single unified belief. Different regions had different ideas, different texts, and different interpretations. Constantine wanted unity, so he gathered bishops and asked them to decide what the official belief should be. And through this process, it was gradually decided which books would be accepted as official and which ones would slowly be set aside. The First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, followed by gatherings like the Councils of Carthage and the Synod of Hippo, slowly shaped what would become the Western Bible. These decisions weren't random. Books were chosen based on who wrote them, how consistent their messages were, and something that many modern scholars also acknowledge. That is, how well these texts fit into the structure of the Roman Church that was taking shape at the time. In reality, Constantine I wasn't just organizing religion. He was shaping a way of thinking for the entire empire. Like every empire, there was a hierarchy. At the top was the emperor, then officials below him, and at the bottom, the common people. In such a system, if a religion says that every individual can directly connect with God without any intermediary, it naturally makes that structure a bit uncomfortable. Think about it. If an ordinary person in a village can connect with God on their own, then why would they need a bishop or a high religious authority? And if a bishop's authority comes from personal spiritual understanding rather than recognition from Rome, then what happens to that entire centralized system? Because of this, over time, the texts that were selected were mostly those that supported the centralization of the church, and the ones that were left out often contained ideas that presented religion as a personal, an inner experience rather than something controlled by an institution. Scholars like Bart D. Ehrman have also pointed out that this process was not completely straightforward or neutral. Many different influences were at play. Now here comes an important point. Ethiopia wasn't even part of this process. It was neither involved in these councils nor bound by the decisions of Constantine I. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church decided for itself which texts were important. That's why they preserved books that reflect a different kind of Christianity, one that focuses on direct experience rather than connection through an institution. These texts remained mahfuz there for centuries, almost as if they were waiting for someone to come and ask the right questions. And now, Mel Gibson is trying to raise those very questions. According to him, understanding all of this is not easy. It requires deep thinking, connecting different ideas, because everything isn't written clearly in one place. Now we come to the beginning of the Book of the Covenant. It describes Jesus speaking directly to his disciples after the resurrection. But the tone feels different. If you look at the New Testament, the post-resurrection accounts are very brief, appearing in a locked room, meeting on the road, a moment by the sea. Jesus appears, says a few things, and then leaves. The disciples seem a bit confused, and the story moves forward quickly. But here, the narrative slows down and goes deeper, as if it's explaining something that was only briefly touched upon elsewhere. In the Book of the Covenant, the way these teachings appear is very different. Here, Jesus speaks as if time is short, and he needs to explain important things clearly. He begins directly with big questions: how the world was created, what the true nature of God is, and what the relationship is between the physical world and the spiritual realm. And in this description, an interesting idea appears. The world is shown on one hand as connected to a true divine light, and on the other as a system shaped by a limited authority that believed itself to be supreme, even though it could not see the full truth. This isn't some light or simple teaching. This is the kind of idea that can completely change the way you see everything. It tries to explain that if God exists, then why is there so much corruption and disorder in the world, and what the real spiritual struggle is actually about? And then comes a warning that really stands out. Here, Jesus tells his disciples that his teachings will be changed over time, not all at once but slowly. His name will remain, buildings will be built in his name, institutions will rise, but what happens inside those institutions will gradually move away from the original message. He clearly explains what to be careful of: religious leaders who use his name to take advantage of people, groups where outward displays of faith replace real inner transformation, and times when his words are used to spread violence or fear. If you look at history, these things seem to come true again and again, whether it's religious wars, the use of religion for power, or different controversies and scandals. That's why some people believe it's either a very strange coincidence, or maybe this is exactly why such texts were not accepted everywhere. Now from here, the story takes an even more interesting turn. It's no longer just about Ethiopian tradition. It becomes a subject for the entire academic world. In 1947, a shepherd named Muhammad Edhib was searching for his lost goat near Qumran. He threw a stone into a cave and heard something break inside. When he went in, he found large clay jars, and inside them were extremely ancient manuscripts. Today, we know these as the Dead Sea Scrolls, considered one of the greatest biblical discoveries of the 20th century. They included very old copies of the Hebrew Bible, some dating back to the 3rd century BCE. And the most interesting part, fragments of the Book of Enoch were also found among them. Now that means the book that people thought was lost for so long had traces here as well, another sign that the story might be much deeper than what we've been told. If you think there might be a reason these texts were set aside, whether spiritual or political, do share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep and fascinating mysteries. This discovery is considered so important because the Dead Sea Scrolls didn't come from a Christian group, but from a Jewish community known as the Essenes, who existed even before Christianity began. This clearly shows that the Book of Enoch wasn't just important to early Christians, but was also valued by Jewish communities before them, enough to preserve it alongside their most sacred texts. Now here's where the most interesting connection appears. When scholars were piecing together the fragments found at Qumran, where was the only complete and preserved version of this book? The answer: Ethiopia. The Ge'ez manuscripts preserved for centuries in monasteries like Debre Damo contained a version of Enoch that closely matched those ancient fragments, which means the work monks had been doing for nearly 2,000 years, copying texts by hand, was not in vain. They didn't preserve a corrupted or altered version, but something very close to the original. This has also been acknowledged by major scholars like George W. E. Nicholsburg, who noted in his research that the Ethiopian version preserves ancient Jewish and early Christian traditions quite accurately. Now just think about it. The book that the Western tradition slowly left behind, that remained almost missing in Europe for 1,600 years, and that James Bruce had to travel to the mountains of Ethiopia to find, was actually once common among people who lived even before the time of Jesus. So the real question flips completely. It's not why Ethiopia preserved unusual or different texts, but why the Western world stopped reading the very texts that were once considered so important. And now we come to a part of the Book of the Covenant that people keep returning to, because it feels strangely connected to the present time as well. It speaks about a time described as a great spiritual test. It doesn't give a specific date or timeline, but instead describes the atmosphere, like a time when trust between people begins to break, and when appearances replace real goodness, and when people say one thing but their lives show something completely different. It even says that in such a time, the name of God will be used to justify wrong actions, like calling injustice right, or hiding the pursuit of power and money behind religion. And then comes a line that really makes you stop and think. It says that when the purifying fire arrives, people won't recognize it. They won't see it as something divine, but as destruction or downfall. In other words, the very thing that comes to bring change will feel the most frightening to people. But those who have truly changed from within are able to see beyond all this chaos because they carry something that cannot be taken away. This inner understanding is described as a kind of light that never goes out. When R.H. and Charles worked on these texts, he noticed something interesting. These writings always operate on two levels. One is direct spiritual guidance for the people of that time, and the other is a larger pattern that repeats itself throughout history. If you look at it this way, these ideas are not meant for any one specific year, like 2026. They apply to every era where people begin to value appearances more than truth, where the name of God is used for purposes that are not truly spiritual. That's why these ideas seem relevant in every century. And maybe that's exactly why monks in places like Debre Damo worked so hard to preserve these texts. These were people who climbed cliffs using ropes just to reach their monastery, but who protected these manuscripts through invasions and turmoil, perhaps because they believed there was something in them that could never truly be erased. Truth is not easy to suppress. If all this is making you see things a little differently, then subscribing to Stone and Bone makes sense, because the story is about to take another interesting turn, and the next part connects to the book of Enoch. The way it describes the origin of evil and the story of fallen angels goes much deeper than what most people have heard. But before that, there's one more important thing to understand. The Ethiopian tradition doesn't see itself as limited only to the Bible. According to them, their heritage goes even further back. In the Kebra Nagast, which means the glory of kings, there is a claim that the Ark of the Covenant still exists in Ethiopia. It is said to be kept inside the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum. According to tradition, it was brought to Ethiopia around 3,000 years ago by Menelik I, believed to be the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Only one monk is responsible for guarding it. He is specially chosen, and he spends his entire life there. He doesn't leave, doesn't speak to outsiders, and doesn't allow anyone to see inside. Is there any solid proof of this? No. There has been no scientific examination and no outsider has been allowed to verify it, but the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church doesn't seem to rely on outside validation. And now, slowly, all of this is coming to light, through the translations of scholars like Ephraim Isaac and Getachew Haley, through explorers like James Bruce, and yes, even because of that shepherd who threw a stone into a cave in 1947. And maybe that's why today, people are finally able to read these texts again. Now, the real question is not whether these texts exist or not. The question is what you choose to do with them. Because the monks of Debre Damo didn't preserve these texts just so someone could hear about them and move on. They did it because they believed this message was for anyone who truly wanted to understand it. And if you've made it this far, it's clear. You are one of them. Those 40 days are no longer lost. If this whole story has changed your perspective even a little, don't forget to subscribe to Never Told You, because the real stories often begin where the official records end.